Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jennifer Reynolds from the South Florida Water Management District. We're going to give folks a few more minutes just to dial in. From what we're seeing, it looks like people are still trying to join the call, and so we just want to give everybody an opportunity to get logged in this platform, and so we'll get started in just a few minutes. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Again, this is Jennifer Reynolds. I'm the Division Director here at the South Florida Water Management District, and I want to welcome you to our Chapter 40E-61 Rule Amendments Round 2 workshop. And so thank you for all participating. It looks like we have close to 120 people online, and so we've got a big group, probably larger than we would have had if we had met in person. And we're really excited that all of you took time out of your day to join us for this workshop today. As I mentioned, this is our round 2 workshops. We went out with round 1 workshops earlier in the year in order to solicit feedback from the public before we even really got started working on draft rule text. And we have text to share with you, and I assume that most of you have downloaded that information from our website. And Stephanie Olson is going to provide an overview of our rule today, and then we will take some questions as well as all of your public comments related to the rule text and the process. But before we get started, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context for those of you who may be new to rulemaking or new to this rule in particular. These rules, many of you may know as the works of the district rules. They were adopted in 1989 before the other BMP programs. It required source controls, BMPs for both ag and non-ag land uses. It required monitoring to show discharge limitations were met by individual landowners. At that time, the water quality strategies for achieving the lake TMDL were described in the District Protection Plan before BMAPs, and the source control component for the plan was this rule. Fast forward to current, and many statutory changes, the most significant of which was in 2016, NEAP directed DEP to adopt the BMAPs as the plans for achieving the total maximum daily loads, and the source control component is the FDACS BMP program for ag and the FDEP BMP programs for non-ag. So I know I'm throwing a lot of acronyms around, and Stephanie is going to clarify those during her presentation if anyone has questions about those. So don't panic as I'm giving a brief summary here with some of the acronyms. But I think for most of our audience, you all are familiar with the acronyms. So DEP became the overarching authority for water quality through the BMAP programs. And what that meant for the district was that the protection plan and this rule needed retooling. And so we did that for the protection plan, and the focus of the protection plan is hydrology and water management, research and monitoring, storage and treatment projects, all in support of the BMAPs. And with this rulemaking process, we are reworking the retooling of all of these rules. And although the district role and focus has shifted, especially for this rule, in drafting this text, we tried to make the most of our statutory authority. We recognized the coordination between the agencies with the DEP and with FDACs. And we describe a process and activities to get the most bang for the buck in areas needing it the most and as expeditiously as possible. So much of what's in here will provide valuable information to our sister agencies, to DEP and to FDACs to optimize their programs as well. This has been a challenging process so far. It will continue to be a challenging process. We look forward to the public participation in this process. And again, we really appreciate everyone coming together in this challenging forum. We would have liked to have met face-to-face, but under the circumstances, we're really glad that you could all participate with us. In addition to Stephanie Olson, who's here and has been leading this effort for some time and has been with the district working on these programs for over 25 years, I also have with me Pam Wade, who's our bureau chief, who leads the efforts for the protection plans and our rulemaking in these areas. And on the line, we have representatives from FDACs and FDEP who will be taking notes and will be happy to answer your questions about their programs, but we don't really have time to do that during this workshop in the format that we have. And so they're taking notes, and so if you have specific questions for them, then please let them know. They will take notes and get back with you after this workshop, and we will look at ways to coordinate so that we can provide frequently asked questions and information about their programs in a future forum that will allow us to work on these issues together. And so with that, I will turn it over to Stephanie, who will get started with our presentation.
Thank you. Welcome to round 2 of the Chapter 40E-61 Rule Development Workshops. As we begin, a couple of small housekeeping items. We have found that with webinars, that there are benefits to holding questions and discussions until the end. So that is how we're going to proceed today. The presentation is only about 21 slides long. At the end of the presentation, we'll take questions on the presentation itself. Then after that question period, we will open it up for public comments. You'll have 3 minutes to provide a public comment. If you have a question or comment, you will use the raise your hand feature by clicking on the raise your hand button. So just to remind everyone, 40E-61, as it exists today, establishes criteria to protect our water resources for entities that discharge to the district's regional water management system. Restoring and protecting our water resources is part of the district's mission, along with connecting with the public. These workshops are one way we connect to and keep the public involved in the work we do. To engage with the public through the rule process, we had round 1 workshops in 5 locations: Okeechobee, Stewart, Fort Myers, Kissimmee, and West Palm Beach. Today, I will provide a brief summary for folks who were unable to attend those. With these round 2 workshops, we will discuss the draft rule text, which was posted at the district's rulemaking website on April 30th. So this is today's agenda. I will provide a background, then I will go into where we are currently in the rulemaking process, and I'll end with the next steps and how you can remain involved. So let's begin with why we are doing this rulemaking. The map on the left-hand side of this slide depicts the Northern Everglades watersheds. We have the Caloosahatchee River watershed in the green color. We have the Lake Okeechobee watershed in the purple color, and we have the St. Lucie River watershed in this orangish yellow color. By law, we must amend the existing rules for the Lake Okeechobee watershed and create new rules for the river watersheds. These rules are just one component of an overall comprehensive strategy that is laid out by the legislature. As this strategy has evolved, so must these rules. The overall strategy must address the water quality conditions depicted here. There is a gap between the current water quality conditions in each of these watersheds compared to where DEP says they need to be. The bars on the left-hand side of each of these graphs depict the restoration goals. The bars to the right depict the most recent 5-year average. Phosphorus is in blue and nitrogen is in orange. These watersheds have been identified by DEP to have impaired water bodies for which water quality goals, called total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, have been established. Note that DEP defined phosphorus and nitrogen goals for St. Lucie, while the lake only has a phosphorus goal and Caloosahatchee only has a nitrogen goal. In round one, I discussed this slide in great detail, explaining how restoration efforts evolved over time. The main point is that there have been many legislative changes that have impacted these rules. The 2016 NEP directed the district to revise 40E-61. The many statutory changes have made the existing rules obsolete as the underlying authorities have changed, so the draft amendments will replace the existing rules. Also, I want to mention that during the 2020 lawmaking session, the legislature passed Section 85 of House Bill 5003, which appears to limit the 40E-61 rulemaking to certain portions of the draft that was released on April 30th, specifically the contents of Part 2. However, it is possible that the contents of Part 1 may be implemented through other means. The full results of the 2020 session are still pending, but the district thought you should be aware of those potential legislative changes as you consider your comments on the draft. The 2016 NEP also redefined the roles and activities in the restoration efforts for the coordinating agencies, which are the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and the South Florida Water Management District. These agencies work together to achieve restoration. This schematic connects the dots on how activities of each agency come together under the overall restoration strategy in the NEP. FDEP is the lead on developing and enforcing basin management action plans to achieve water quality. DAX is the lead on agricultural BMPs. And the district is the lead on implementing the watershed protection plans, which include the watershed construction projects and the research and water quality monitoring program. The green box in the bottom right shows where 40E-61 fits into the big picture. It is a program under the watershed protection plans. Now that you know where 40E-61 fits into the big picture, this slide shows the specific directives under the NEP. The legislature directed that the district include monitoring in these rules and that the rules must be created for the river watersheds. The legislature also requires that the district update the watershed protection plans with the latest information. The statute also directed a boundary change. The map on the left side of this slide depicts the existing 40E-61 boundary. The map on the right shows that same boundary on top of the NEP boundary, so you can see where the rules need to be expanded. Before we lay out the draft rules, let's do a quick recap of the round one workshops. The first set of workshops were held in November, and we presented the concepts laid out here and received input. Here is a summary of the public comments and input we received at the workshops. The district received many comments on the scope of these rules, some wanting a broader scope and others wanted it to be more limited. Other comments pertain to the monitoring data and dealing with hotspots. With the workshops completed, staff began drafting the rule text to build out the concepts discussed at the workshops. The draft rule will consist of two parts, a watershed assessment and individual landowner requirements. And I will go into each of these in more detail in the next few slides. So the objective of Part 1, the Watershed Assessment, is to describe the processes for collecting and assessing data to identify activities to improve the quality, quantity, timing, and distribution of surface water. District data will primarily be used for the assessment, including data from the expanded monitoring network, although other sources of data may also be considered if they meet the necessary criteria. That is in response to comments we received at the workshops, where the district was asked to review data from other sources, but also asked to ensure that the data evaluated were of proper quality. The district will work with DEP to prioritize the targeted restoration areas, which are defined in BMAPs. To focus limited resources, the district will complete a comprehensive assessment of these areas to characterize sources and factors contributing to the water quality problems, trying to answer what are the drivers having the greatest impact and how do we address them. The assessments will consist of the items that we've laid out in the slide. Reports summarizing the assessment findings will identify activities to expedite tailored nutrient reductions to achieve the greatest impact for water quality restoration. This will allow us to address hotspots. This slide lays out a few examples of possible findings, including identifying performance enhancements for projects, such as improving the operation of SDAs, new projects, which could be new stormwater treatment areas, or nutrient reduction technologies. Enhanced source controls, such as tailwater recovery projects, or a reevaluation of BMPs if the data indicate that it may be beneficial. The district will provide scientific and technical support for that effort. The rules in Part 1 also lay out the reporting requirements for the assessment findings. The district will publish the findings annually, update the district's website, and conduct a public meeting to discuss the progress. And if any of the projects or programs included in Basin Management Action Plans are not meeting the BMAP implementation timeline, the district will facilitate a public meeting inviting the coordinating agency partners to join with us in seeking public input, discussing obstacles, and refining district findings if necessary. And that is what is laid out in Part 1. Now, Part 2 lays out the individual monitoring requirements, and the objective is to provide for a monitoring program for those not implementing DACs or DEP BMPs as required under a Basin Management Action Plan. These entities will be required to have a permit for an approved water quality monitoring plan. And if the discharge from their property does not meet state water quality standards as defined by DEP, the permittee will be notified that they need to implement BMPs as required by the appropriate agency noted in the BMAP. And that concludes the presentation on the draft rules. Now this next slide goes into the tasks we've completed and our schedule for completing the rule amendments. We really welcome and strongly encourage your feedback on these draft rules. We would like to have your comments by July 3rd so that we can keep to our schedule. Just so you know, the next steps coming up, we have 2 more Zoom workshops to complete. The next one will be May 21st at 5:30 p.m. We will be presenting the same presentation. After that, we will review the public comments that we've received and adjust the draft rule text as needed. And I want to remind everyone that they can leave comments and receive the latest information on the draft rules at the district's website. The link is shown here at the bottom of this slide. That is also where you can find the draft rule text if you've not yet had a chance to review it. And at this point, we're going to start taking questions on the presentation. And I will ask Danielle, can you let me know who has their hand raised?
Yes, we have Diane Perry.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, when you did the water samples, the water quality varies on the depth of the water at which you take your water sample. Do you know at what depth the water samples are taken? Did you get that?
Okay. Sorry about that. We were on mute. This is Pam Wade. Our sampling crews have very strict quality control procedures laid out in standard operating procedures for field data collection. I know that it's specifically specified in there on the depth that a sample has to be collected below the surface for surface water samples if you're doing grab samples. And I don't know that exact value, but we do adhere to the standard operating procedures that were set by DEP for field quality, field data collection procedures. So,
Well, in Lake Okeechobee, you know, the time in which it's really a concern is when we have the high winds, you know, from hurricane season that steers up all the sediment at the bottom. So, you know, I'm sure the water sample at the top is probably pretty good, but if you go down a little ways, you know, it really gets, you know, highly nutrient rich.
So it sounds like you're referring to samples collected in Lake Okeechobee. So this rule is actually referring to samples collected representative of discharges off of properties, runoff within the watershed, going into the district canal system.
Okay, and I appreciate that as well, but does any of this pertain to Lake Okeechobee?
It pertains to Lake Okeechobee and the estuaries, and that we're trying to improve the water quality before it goes to those receiving water bodies. But the actual rule criteria for landowners to have to meet monitoring requirements is, if it's applicable to them, it is to monitor runoff coming from their property. And then the district, the part one of the rule has got to do with watershed runoff collectively within the different basins of the watersheds that the district collects samples on. So there's another totally different program for monitoring the receiving water bodies like the lakes and the Lake Okeechobee and the estuaries.
And then aren't the individual property owners self-monitored, so they do their own testing for their water?
If they elect to monitor their discharges under this rule instead of participating in the DEP or the DACS BNP programs, they would be monitoring themselves, but they would have to be meeting the strict criteria laid out in the rule to be able to have an approved monitoring plan. And that would include the standard operating procedures that DEP has set out that the district also has to follow for our data collection. They would have to follow the same.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Okay, Danielle, who is the next participant that has a question?
Yeah, the next one up was Patricia Burke.
Trish, did you have a comment? Or a question, I'm sorry. Did you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was just going to answer the question of the former speaker. For the watershed, our depth is 0.5 meters.
Thank you, Trish.
And in the lake, just as a side for the water quality, when we have high winds and the lake gets stirred up, because it's shallow, it's pretty homogeneous throughout the water column with that, you know, with siltation. And we, again, do half a meter, and we do other things at other depths in the lake.
Thank you very much. Okay. Danielle, who is the next person up?
Next up, we had Rich Budell raise his hand, then it went away. So Rich, if you'd like to say something, feel free to speak up. After that, we've got Doug Gaston.
Okay. Doug, did you have a question?
Yes. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So thanks for providing this update and getting us the text. And we look forward to participating in this. Doug Gaston, Audubon, Florida. So I have a comment and a question, maybe two questions. So first, we are encouraged that the boundary is expanded to include the Upper Kissimmee, because I think the old boundary for the Lake Okeechobee drainage basin in the rules did not. So I think that's helpful. And we're also, I think, cautiously optimistic about this approach that identifies priority targeted restoration areas, because we know there are some watersheds that are far worse in terms of nutrients than others. And that's a way to start attacking this problem, then maybe that's a good way to go about it. And also the allocation by sub-watershed, because I think that starts to give us a realistic view, even though this information has already been out there. But when you allocate it that way, I think it gives you a realistic view of how far we really need to go if we're going to meet the TMDL. So, but Stephanie, you said something a few minutes ago about coordinating some of the things in this draft rule with the time frame set forth in the BMAP. And I think my first question is, well, in this draft rule, there are a number of things in here. It talks about, monitoring, implementing, assessing, and things like that, but doesn't really give us a time frame for how those things will be, pursued and time limits on getting those things done. And I think that's an important point, because when you look back over to the BMAP, which you're referencing, the BMAP that was adopted for Lake Okeechobee is, to be fair, anemic. And it says that, at the present course, we're not going to meet the TMDL in 20 years. And then it kind of opens up this process again to gather more information from the district, other stakeholders, et cetera. And so there's a very uncertain path forward under the BMAP. And without some more specificity in terms of how these things are going to get done and when they're going to get done, a lot of uncertainty around that. And when you put those two things together, my question, I think, at the end of that is, well, if we're at 400 or 500 metric tons and the TMDL is 105, and, even smaller for certain watersheds, how are we going to get there specifically? And you may not be able to answer that at this point. That may be, a larger conversation, but I'm really concerned about how those two things sync up. This rule, the BMAP, and the uncertainties raised by the fact that the BMAP has just this sort of uncertain process. We're still not sure what's going to happen. And I don't see the level of specificity and the timing around the different things that are included in this draft rule, all of which are good things, by the way, but just not the level of specificity in terms of when they're going to get done. Sorry to take so long to try to frame that, but that's my comment and my question. Thanks.
So this is Pam Wade. That's a very good question. Thank you. The process for achieving the TMDL, excuse me, is a long-term evolving iterative process. And what you'll notice in the BMAP is it's estimating projects and intended performance out, to certain timeframes. The protection plans, which part one of this rule addresses that the district will be responsible for, will help support that feeding into the BMAP and the next steps to improve water quality. So we provide the measured data the science-supported information that will help steer the path of the BMAP as it moves into the future. So the BMAPs are reviewed every 5 years and updated and readopted as needed. So the protection plan updates, we're planning on doing annual reviews, giving you the latest scientific information based on what we're seeing in the data, what we're seeing in the research, how the projects are performing, and then a more comprehensive 5-year update in concert with the BMAP 5-year reviews. So we're trying to align our process with the BMAP process, but at the same time, not waiting 5 years before we're giving updates to the public and getting their feedback, and which is why we committed to these annual public meetings in the rule.
Okay. Danielle, who is our next person with a question?
Yeah, the next attendee, it's a 772 number. The last 4 digits are 3858.
Okay. Please state your question. We're looking for whoever's calling from 3858, area code 772. Okay, remember, if you're on your phone, *6 mutes and unmutes your phone.
Okay, we can see that you're trying to unmute, but we can't.
Oh, okay. Can you
hear
hear me
you?
now?
Oh, yep, now we can hear you.
I'm very sorry. I had my phone muted and the *6 wasn't working right, but I got it now. Thank you. Mark Perry, Florida Oceanographic. Kind of a follow-up and similar question to Doug about the BMAP and this tied into BMAP. The concerns we have on implementation of water quality monitoring and how the results of that monitoring, if we're looking at that and determining, okay, it's not meeting the TMDL, and even if it's not tied to the time frame of the TMDL, you're using the TMDL as the line and the guidance and says, okay, it's got to meet that requirement. If it's not, what is basically the consequence? What's the enforcement? What do you revoke the permit of discharge into works of the district? What is the consequence? Do you have a fine in place where the person's not meeting that water quality? They have a certain time frame to meet it. If they don't, there's a consequence if they're not meeting that water quality standard that we're setting for the watershed.
Within the rule right now, we have laid out that if they're not meeting their water quality standards, that they would have to, we would notify the appropriate coordinating agency, and they would be required to implement DMPs under the appropriate agency.
So under this rule, just like all of the other district rules, we have complete authority to enforce and collect fines or penalties. I'm not sure that I'm using the correct legal term, but monetary fines. And as far as the timeline for compliance, they have to submit a water quality monitoring plan that we'll have to approve. And the time will depend on the amount of data that they're able to collect each year. Someone may not discharge very often. Say they discharge maybe twice a year, and that may not be enough data to be able to determine that they are exceeding state water quality standards if we only look at a year's worth of data. So the water quality monitoring plan that we approve within their permit will take these things into consideration, but we will be looking at their data annually to determine whether we're able to make that determination of compliance.
And so that'll be in compliance with all existing permits, and they'll have to come into compliance with that.
What do you mean by existing permits?
Well, you have existing permits with the works of the district. Let's say north of the lake is over 750 existing permits. You're requiring monitoring on these permits, or through the rule, the revised rule, you're going to require monitoring by the private landowner. And if that private landowner is only doing it once a year, and you determine, well, that monitoring plan isn't enough, or it is enough, and we still don't see any violation, then we're going to go ahead and continue to allow you to monitor instead of implement BMPs. And then the other question is, if you do determine and these other jurisdictions like FDACS or FDEP and the district working together look at this and determine, this person needs to be in compliance and the BMPs aren't working, then how do you get more enforcement to improve the water quality coming off of that property?
So one thing I'd like to make sure everyone is clear on is that this rule draft that you're looking at is eventually, when it's finalized, intended to replace the existing rule from 1989. And then when you asked how it affects different landowners, the applicability with this rule, it only applies to landowners who have chosen not to implement the rule adopted BMPs specified under a BMAP. So that's the only time that this rule would apply to someone.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for those comments or those questions. Okay. Danielle, who's up next?
Next up, we have Gary Ritter.
Okay, Gary, welcome.
Hey, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. The question that I have, and I'll start out with a comment first. In the definitions section, you really don't have a definition for a non-point source discharger. So when you look at part 2, you start out in 40E-61.200, you start out with saying a non-point source discharger that discharges to or within these watersheds. And so there's a lot of different non-point source discharges coming from different land uses throughout this watershed. And I guess how will all the different land uses be addressed in this rule? And as a follow-up comment, the water quality monitoring network, as I see it, doesn't seem to represent all land uses. So what types of methodologies will you use to assess all the land uses in all the non-point source dischargers in those non-point dischargers that don't, I mean, how will you categorize them in if they're not in or wouldn't be required to be in an FDACS BMP program, how will they go through a permitting process? I know I said a lot there and I apologize, but I was trying to get it in all in.
Hi, Gary, this is Pam. Thanks for your question. The hierarchy is, we start with, is there a DEP BMAP with rule adopted BMPs that they are regulated under? So that's where it starts. So that's where we didn't need to define non-point source discharge, because to be regulated under any of those BMP programs, they have to be one of the non-point source discharges. So that's the first checkoff, if you will. So we are relying on DEP and GAC's determination as to whether they are required to implement their BMPs or not. If they fall under that category and they choose not to implement the BMPs, in lieu of that, they choose to monitor, then they have to come to us under this rule to get a permit.
Regardless of what.
It takes out the complexity of having to determine if someone is a point source or non-point source. They have to be a non-point source to be regulated by the DACS or DEP BMP program.
Okay. Okay. And then, in other words, if let's say they're a rural ranchette that might be under the DEP program because they're considered urban, and it's a non-point source discharger because they're on a septic tank, if DEP would require them to do BMPs under the BMAP, and if they decided, well, I don't want to do BMPs, then they would have to come to you to develop a water quality monitoring plan.
Yes, under this rule they would.
Okay, okay. And then, you know, your water quality monitoring network doesn't seem to represent all land uses. Are you going to be adding additional stations to have more of a representation, or are you going to rely on DEP's monitoring data?
So the district's monitoring network, you're correct in that it is a collective representation of an area. That area is typically going to have mixed land uses. And so one of the benefits of Part 1 is for the district to be able to zoom into areas that we identify as maybe the highest priority for focused attention for implementing more projects and programs enhancing what's already being done there or needs to be done there. So the priority targeted restoration areas, we are using that to zoom into areas that we feel need more attention. And in that case, we would look at the district data, we would look at DEP's data if it meets the criteria of the rule. We might look at local municipalities' data if they're collecting any and it meets the criteria of the rule, the quality control, quality assurance requirements. And if we don't have enough data to be able to make determinations, what would come out of that is we would make a recommendation that we need to do more monitoring maybe in that area.
Okay, all right. And as a final comment, I was very happy to hear Jennifer Reynolds say that in, you know, like the efforts that you just explained, there is going to be, because it wasn't really clear in this first go around with the rule, how much of a collaborative effort there was going to be by the coordinating agencies. And what I heard her in the very beginning of, you know, before you all started the presentation, that's going to be a very integral, important part to making this whole process work.
Absolutely.
That's all I had. Thank you.
All right, thank you for those questions. All right, Danielle, who's up next?
Next up, we have Yogesh Chan.
Hello, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so this is Yogesh Chan from the Everglades Foundation. First of all, thank you very much for updating 40E-61 rule. This is a very timely process and very important for Northern Everglades and estuaries. I have several questions. The very first one is, could you please define PTRS? I know it is related to the FDP's BMAP report. I'm asking this specifically because when I was going through the draft, as I understood, the water quality monitoring program permits, they will be allowed only within these PTRs. Is that right?
Thank you for that question. A PTRA, that stands for Priority Targeted Restoration Area. The basin management action plans that DEP has produced for each watershed, it goes through and it ranks targeted restoration areas in each BMAP. And what the district is proposing to do under these rules is to consult with DEP to select areas, those targeted restoration areas that we want to prioritize. In other words, that we want to do a very detailed assessment in. The reason is this area is quite large. The Northern Everglades about 5 million acres, roughly. And so the idea is to go in and zoom into a location where we can do a detailed assessment and try to determine what is causing the water quality problems within that area so that we can target projects and programs to address those specific water quality problems.
Okay, understood. But my follow-up question is, the water quality monitoring requirement for the landowners who are not willing to implement BMPs, is it restricted to these PTRAs, or any landowner who is not enrolling or implementing BMPs needs to have water quality monitoring plan?
That is applicable, the monitoring by individual landowners is watershed-wide for all 3 watersheds. It's not limited to the targeted restoration areas that are prioritized for focused attention.
Okay. My second question is, in the draft, it is mentioned that water quality discharge targets would be consistent with FDP's targets. For example, for Lake Okeechobee watershed, total phosphorus concentration target would be 0.12 milligrams per liter, and total nitrogen 1.54 milligrams per liter. Similarly, there is concentration target for St. Lucie. However, such concentration target is not specified for Caloosahatchee. I understand the Caloosahatchee TMDL is in terms of load, not concentrations. But when we are talking about water quality monitoring plan and target for the discharge from individual parcel, what would be that target for parcels within Caloosahatchee?
So that's a really good question. And the answer is it depends. Those TMDLs are very specific to the receiving water body. So when an individual, if they decide that they want to monitor, their monitoring plan and the state water quality standards that they'll have to meet depends on where they're located. For example, if it's someone in Upper Kissimmee, they might propose a value that takes into account the assimilation factor for the distance between where they're located and where the lake is. So that's something that becomes apparent or is developed through a cooperative proposal between them and the district, and relating it to the TMDL's numeric nutrient criteria and other water quality standards established by DEP.
But then how this would ensure that we are meeting TMDL, or how does this fit in the BMAP itself? Because, if a permittee is proposing a specific concentration target, so basically you are saying that 0.12 milligrams per liter is not a discharge target for a permittee within Lake Okeechobee watershed. It is something that they would propose?
I'm saying that it can be. I mean, it could be that the discharge limitation, depending on their specific situation with their land, could be a concentration associated with the TMDL. But they may propose scientific methods justifying that what comes off of their property can be a number associated with that, but not exactly that.
And this is applicable to all three watersheds.
Yes.
But then what is the meaning of those target concentrations?
The target concentrations are what the BMAPs need to achieve collectively for the watershed as a whole to protect the receiving water body. So anything that we do, whether it be the DAX BMPs, the projects under the protection plan, the BMAP programs by local entities, collectively need to achieve those water quality standards at the receiving water body. And there are methods that DEP has established to determine whether that's met or not. But individual projects, individual landowners upstream don't necessarily have to meet those TMDL targets individually. It's a collective compliance.
So when you say to demonstrate through some scientific method, some calculations or some modeling work that whatever their land is discharging will able to meet the TMDL targets at that time, or TMDL targets or some target concentrations at receiving water bodies. So when you say that, do you imply that, for example, in Lake Okeechobee watershed, that would be 0.12 milligrams per liter of total phosphorus?
I'm not understanding your question. Are you asking if a landowner has to meet the concentration that's associated with the TMDL target for a specific watershed?
Yes, because I mean, they are going to propose some number for water quality that they are discharging, and by showing that it will reduce to certain concentration when it goes to the receiving water body, correct?
This is Jennifer Reynolds. So it sounds like you have an idea of a way that we could maybe include language in the rule or in our monitoring or in our compliance portion, that you have some thoughts and ideas of how we could do that, that would help us with identifying and documenting the methods in order to achieve what you're talking about. In the interest of time, because we have quite a few people with their hands up, I think if we could get some comments from you about your specific ideas about those methods, then we could have a follow-on conversation with you if we have additional questions in order to incorporate your comments into the rule or into the methods or the appendix of how we do our procedures. That would be extraordinarily helpful.
I'll be very happy to send my thoughts. So after this meeting, I'll make sure to submit comments through the district website.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes, we're hoping to have everyone submit plenty of comments and questions, especially comments on what they would like us to consider as we move forward.
Okay, Danielle, who's up next?
Next up, we have Richard Vidal.
Hey, good afternoon, Pam, Stephanie, Jennifer's. I guess there's multiple Jennifers there. You can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, great. Thanks for the overview, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. I know there's no clock ticking down, but I will be brief. So Overall, my first comment is that I believe that part 1 of this rule really belongs in the legislative requirement for you and DEP and the Department of Agriculture to develop and populate an interagency agreement. I know that that agreement was updated, I think, in 2017. And I think the statutory language in 373-4595 is pretty clear that the processes, procedures, the tools, the methods that you use in assessing water quality data, evaluating BMP performance, determining how those data might lead to improved programs or improved BMPs or revised BMPs or research projects or improvements in the monitoring plan. Those are all elements that should be incorporated into the interagency agreement, not through rulemaking. So that's overall comment number 1. I know that that's a policy issue, perhaps a legal interpretation issue, but it's one I think is, I would strongly urge the district to reassess the inclusion of part 1 in this rulemaking at all. Part 2, again, kind of high level stuff. I'll repeat what Gary Ritter said. It isn't clear to me at all that your proposed network is representative of all land uses. I appreciate, Pam, your comment that it is an amalgam of land uses, teasing out BMP performance or anything else from that existing network, absent flow data and a lot of other, I think, parameters is going to be very, very difficult. And my last comment is legacy phosphorus. Stephanie, Pam, I know you guys have been around this issue long enough to know that trying to tease out the impact of current land use impacts, current land use management tools across the landscape from that burden of legacy phosphorus that exists in your own works, in the sediments of your own works, and are released every time your works are operated, every time a gate opens, every time a structure releases water, it's releasing sediments laden with phosphorus from that basin or sub-basin, and teasing out the effect of the impact of BMPs or really any other land use change from that enormous legacy load is, to say the least, going to be a huge challenge. I don't have any questions. That concludes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. We appreciate your comments.
Okay, in the interest of time, because we want to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak, we will also be taking comments. We'll take both comments and questions now. So Danielle, who's up next?
We've got Diane Perry.
Hi, thank you. I wasn't clear. Are there grandfathered permits that are exempt from the DEP PMAPs?
DEP what? Oh, BMAP.
PMAPs. Are there grandfathered permits that are exempt?
There are no grandfathered permits.
There are, okay. And then also, are there going to be any actionable ways to achieve the TMDLs that'll be offered? Like if somebody doesn't meet the TMDL, I know there's monetary, but are there other actionable ways to achieve that TMDL?
So the TMDL has to be met by a plethora of projects and programs under the BMAP. So when we're talking about someone having to meet water quality standard if they choose to do monitoring, that does require actions and measures and enforcement and compliance.
Because the reason I'm saying is that there's several actionable ways that I don't see are being used, even for like the legacy phosphorus. And so a lot of this, I feel like it's all gathering information and not doing actionable things that could remove the phosphorus. So, good.
So one of the things that I think that everyone's realizing is there's much to be learned, and that requires data to be able to make scientific-based decisions on what needs to be next. What does the next action need to be? Are the projects that are in place working? If not, do they need to be enhanced? Do we need new projects? Where do those new projects need to be? Do they need to be storage projects? Do they need to be
there is a way to use the unconsolidated sludge, which takes out a lot of phosphorus from the water. And, I don't know why that those actionable items can't be implemented, and
so
I
we
hear.
are.
Go ahead.
Thank you for your comment. That sounds like something that would fall under innovative technologies, which is covered under the rule as one of the things that we would be looking at. But thank you for your comment. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay. Danielle, who's next?
Next up, we have Paul Gray.
Paul, please go ahead.
Okay, hi, thanks. Most of my topics were covered. I just wanted to clarify one thing. No landowner has ever opted to do their own water quality monitoring, have they?
Under the existing permit, Stephanie, you'll have to answer that. Anyone collecting data?
Well, under the existing permit.
I mean, nobody's allowed to under this rule because it doesn't exist yet, but under the.
No, Paul, not that I'm aware of at this time.
Okay. Well, and it's just going to be a data challenge because, the sub-basin monitoring that we do now, it kind of tells you there's a tributary that has problems upstream. But when you guys go into your priority restoration areas, you're not going to know which properties or what parts of some properties might be the problem areas. So we've got a lot of monitoring to do before we even can have well-informed stuff. So a lot of work to do. We will try to help. That's all.
Thank you for your comment, Paul. Okay. Who's next, Danielle?
Next up, we have Becky Harris.
Becky, are you on the line? Becky, you need to unmute if you're still interested in making a comment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
I had to unmute my computer.
Okay. Oops. Did you have your comment? Oh. Okay. Well, hopefully Becky will call back. Danielle, who's next?
Next is Ernie Barnett.
Welcome, Ernie. Ernie, are you there?
Yes, I had to unmute. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk and provide these comments. They're very similar to Rich Budel's comments. I think it's really important to look at both parts of the proposed rule. And I think part one of the rule, I think clearly under existing statutes, was always intended to be implemented through the interagency agreement. And I urge you to look carefully at 373.4595, paragraph B, 3B, where it states the interagency agreement, which has well-defined functions of all the agencies. It must specify how best management practices for non-agricultural non-point sources are developed and how all best management practices are implemented and verified consistent with 43067 and this section, and must address measures to be taken by coordinating agencies during any best management practice reevaluation performed pursuant to subparagraphs 5 and 10. And I think what you're what you're doing in part 1 of this rule is actually unilaterally doing the reevaluation without it being done through the interagency agreement. So I urge you to look hard at that and to focus those time, energy, and effort in doing that reevaluation of BMP performance through the interagency agreement and not unilaterally through a district rule. As it relates to part 2, there are some technical issues that I would like to go over with the district. We'll provide comments and communicate directly to the district on what those specifically are. But I think a few things that have been explained today provide some clarity, but I'm not sure that the intent that was outlined in the presentation and in the subsequent questions and answers line up exactly with the way the words are written in part 2, and look forward to having continued dialogue with the district and working on clarifying and refining the part 2 of the rule. So thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments, and we'll look forward for your specific written comments. Danielle, who's next?
It looks like Becky Harris has signed back on here. So if we could jump to her.
Okay, Becky? Okay, we can't hear you yet.
How about now?
Now we can hear you.
Yeah, the problem is I'm getting a bunch of feedback. Anyway, it's regarding monitoring and consequences. Kind of a follow-up to Gary Ritter and Mark Perry's. And I think Pam mentioned that people who are not part of the BMAP process then need to sign up for these permits for the district. So, and Pam, I believe, said that they must contact the district. What if they don't? How do you know who is signing up, who is not? I believe for, I don't know, decades, none of these TMDLs have been met. So, obviously, all these nutrients are beginning to come out. And I apologize.
Ms. Harris, we're having a really hard time hearing you. I think you have audio through both your computer and your phone, but I think your phone is muted and your computer is where the audio is coming from, but now we can barely hear you.
How about now?
That's great.
Okay. Did you get the first part?
No, we didn't. I'm sorry. If you could say it again, we'd really appreciate it.
Okay, it goes back to some of Gary Ritter's follow-up question and Mark Perry's. I think Pam mentioned that the people who are not involved in the BMP BMAP process need to contact the district for these permits. What if they don't contact the district? And so that's one question. My guess is that these TMDLs have not been met for decades. So obviously we still have lots of nutrient issues. I think this volunteer process is part of the problem. So I also missed the first meeting, and I think it's my understanding that the district has 700 monitoring sites throughout. Can't they monitor those sites, find the hot spots, move upstream, and identify where the process problems are?
The first question was how are we notified if landowners need to participate in this program? And basically, we will be working with our coordinating agency partners, and if we're notified by DAX or DEP that someone has not signed up for their program that needs to, then the district would contact that person and ask them to get a permit. BMP implementation is not voluntary within the Northern Everglades because of the Basin Management Action Plans, but they do have the option, all entities do have the option of electing to monitor instead of implementing BMPs. And regarding the number of monitoring sites within the Northern Everglades, we do have a large monitoring network, and we've just expanded it some. We have monitoring at our structures. Those we typically call our basin loading stations, because we collect concentration data and flow, and we can calculate load from those areas. We also have stations that are upstream of those areas. Those we typically just have concentration information. I don't believe we have 700 sites. That seems a little bit more than what we actually have. But we do have monitoring, and we are going to be using that monitoring to hone in on those targeted restoration areas. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to work with DEP to prioritize which areas we need to focus on, and we'll be looking within those areas, trying to outline where the problems are and what the problem is within those areas. So that will hopefully allow us to focus on the hot spots that you speak of.
And
So just-
Ms. Harris, I just wanted to also add that we're not waiting for some time in the future. So as you mentioned, we are already doing some of that work now, and we are identifying areas and projects that may be able to address some of the concerns and the problem areas that we currently see under the monitoring that we're already doing.
That's fantastic. The one thing that I kept hearing from the FDACS people at various meetings is they don't have enough staff to go out to all of their sites, which is why I thought these 40E-61 permits would be a great area to pick up the slack there.
That's a great comment. If you wouldn't mind also providing us some of these ideas in written comments, and we will also share them with our coordinating agencies to look at how we can implement all of the statutes better as we move forward.
Thank you.
Okay, Danielle, who's next?
Next up, we have Gary Ritter.
Welcome back, Gary.
Yeah, welcome back. No, just I wanted to reiterate a couple of general comments that Ernie and Rich had made, and I agree that not only part one, but the little introductory preamble that you have in this rule, which seems kind of odd to put at the beginning of the rule, but I kind of feel that they belong in a more formal interagency agreement memorandum of understanding between the coordinating agencies. I also agree with Rich that the big challenge is going to be legacy phosphorus and how you tease that out. I think that's gonna really pose a real difficult time for you all to when you're trying to determine various hotspots and determine what's going on in the watershed. So, and Rich is absolutely correct. Water Management District canals are going to be part of that, and have to be part of that process as well. And other than that, we really stress that all aspects of this rule, when we finally get to the final draft of it, that it becomes a very collaborative approach to assessing and reevaluating what's going on in the watershed. And that's all I have. Thank you very much, all y'all, for great presentation and the opportunity to participate in this.
Thanks a lot, Gary, and we'll look forward to receiving comments from you in writing as well. Thank you. Danielle, who's next?
Next up, we have Mark Perry.
Yes, thanks. Appreciate it. I do like the preamble. Actually, the introduction page is a nice descriptor of how we came about and how we're arriving at this point in time to revise the rule under the Northern Everglades and Estuary Protection Program, and how we got here and why we're doing this. And I really think we need to look forward to part 2 and implementation and what's going to happen in that. But to just I just wanted to make a comment on previous comments, and that is legacy phosphorus. Understanding that legacy phosphorus is everywhere, and it's still the responsibility of the landowner or the people who have the runoff, to provide mitigation to that runoff, and basically to provide, how we're going to address that. Can we distinguish what's legacy and what's not? Well, it's all legacy if you look at it, that over years that land has been used for certain purposes and has a legacy buildup of phosphorus-rich soils, which then rain off or run off into works of the district and into watershed. And so we need to address all of that water coming in, whether it's containing legacy phosphorus or not, and understanding the source of that problem. And so it is important at these monitoring sites and stations to go upstream with the private landowners or even on public lands and go upstream of these areas and find out where the sources of that nutrients loading or the pollution loading is coming from. And that will be evident once we see those discharge points. There's canals around the St. Lucie Basin, for instance, the C23, 24, and C44 canals, which have over 93 different sub-basin watersheds that drain into them at point sources. They're culverts. They're actual drainage culverts that come off of the land at a point directly into the canals, the major canals. Those are excellent points to start in a monitoring situation, but then if you go upstream from there, you'll find in those lateral canals or lateral ditches that enter into that where that pollutant's coming from. And as a tax owner player, I would much rather, work upstream and find the source of that problem and work with that landowner to stop that pollution at the source than have to build big reservoirs and STAs downstream to fix it there. So please understand, I'm all about let's address the water quality situation at the source, but let's not forget that legacy phosphorus is everywhere and it's always going to be there, but it's a part of the land use that either has gone on for years or continues to go on and continues to enter into our watershed. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. Okay, Danielle, who's next?
Next up, we have a 561 area code phone number, 236-2964.
Okay, whoever is calling from the phone number ending in 2964, please unmute your phone.
Good afternoon, Stephanie. It's Benita Whalen with the Florida Cattlemen's Association. How are you?
We're doing well. Please state your comment.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to Jennifer and Pam for this opportunity. The Cattlemen's Association, as you remember back in August, President Matt Pierce and President-elect Gene Lawless came and spoke when the discussions about starting the rule was initiated by the district. And so they continue to closely monitor its progress, including these second round of rulemaking workshops. Just wanted to mention that I think we are seeing progress as far as the coordinating agency roles that was mentioned earlier. Just want to encourage that those roles aren't duplicated for efficiency. I think everyone on the phone, realizes we have some work to do and some progress to be made. So we just encourage being efficient and not overlapping roles and use already established, such as DEP, BMAPs, or water quality rules versus trying to create additional components that overlap or are related to their rules. Also want to say and remind everyone that, best management practices are just one portion of the treatment train. And realistically, the percent reduction from that portion is the smallest in the overall slice of the pie, so to speak. And we're very encouraged to hear the discussion about projects, both sub-regional and regional and public projects, but, those typically are not regulatory type approaches. Those are voluntary solicitation type approaches. And I understand that, you're going to be using some of the data to target those areas, which is good and fine. I mean, we want to be as effective as possible with getting those projects implemented, but they are not regulatory. And, public meetings also don't need to be in rule. They can be regularly conducted for updates like they had been in the past. I would like to, if you could just bear with me for a second, touch on Mark's comment about legacy or residual phosphorus. I mean, that residual is throughout the watershed on public lands and public systems, from spraying and public canal systems to public lands practices. So I do appreciate that you mention it, but it isn't, I would just caution to target that just to private landowners. And with that, I just say thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Benita. Okay, Danielle, who's next?
Next up, we have Nyla Pipes.
Okay, Nyla?
Hi there, Nyla Pipes, One Florida Foundation. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. So I wanted to touch on the legacy phosphorus conversation and the idea that we can trace back to some ultimate source based upon, following culverts and canals. And I just want to talk about groundwater flow and this tendency we have to sort of eliminate groundwater flow from the conversation, which is not fair or accurate. It's called non-point source pollution for a reason, and that is it's all kind of pooling from a lot of different places, and it's pretty hard to trace. Not that we shouldn't be trying, not that we shouldn't have a robust monitoring system, but this is exactly why our monitoring system has to be really robust and not just situated in certain locations, but throughout the system, so that we can get at that. It's also why septic issues are such a big deal. And I know people get really irritated with me because I continue to talk about it. But, according to the LACO Basin Management Action Plan, you've got 124,176 septic systems within that whole region around Lake O. I mean, they're situated on every water body, every bit of the upper chain of lakes. They pollute our groundwater. And 20 to 30% is about what they remove of phosphorus. They were never meant to remove nutrients, period. So we've got to keep all of that in mind, not just ag, not just the land use over the last 100 years. We've got to keep in mind that there's a legacy that all of us bear. And I think it's a dangerous slippery slope when we start saying, oh, well, we can just trace it back to so-and-so's property, because we've got to keep groundwater flow, in the mix. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. Danielle, who's up next?
Next up, we have John Cassani.
Okay, John? John, are you still on?
Sorry, it just looks like there were two layers of muting there. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Sorry for the confusion. John Cassani, Clusa Waterkeeper. Had a quick question. If an agricultural operation or property chooses the BMP option, I'm assuming the basis for compliance is presumptive. And if the district is monitoring in downstream mixing zones, and you want to go a little beyond in terms of confirmation of that presumptive compliance, How will you attribute specific properties from monitoring in a mixing zone? So how do you go upstream, identify the contributing property on that basis? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. The plan is to, as I said, go into the priority targeted restoration areas and try to do a detailed analysis. I don't know that we would be specifically able to isolate one particular property. As you're right, it would be the downstream water quality monitoring would be representative of multiple entities within that area. So if it was determined that there was a problem within that area, we would have to contact both DACS and DEP about all the entities within that particular area.
So the idea is we'll have water quality that will represent the collective dischargers. And we will look at things like, well, what's driving the water quality? Or is it an area that's primarily ag? And if it is, then we would look to DACS to see if they have people that haven't necessarily signed up for the DACS program yet, and maybe they would become priority areas for DACS to ensure that they get everyone signed up. If it's not primarily ag, I mean, a lot of these areas are very mixed land uses, we would be able to identify if it's more of a flow issue or a concentration issue and start looking at the kinds of projects that the district needs to propose in protection plans, for example, or if it's, for example, a flow issue and it seems to be more coming from our secondary and tertiary systems, we would have our cost share programs that might help do tailwater recovery systems to hold more water back. So there's a lot of different things that can happen depending on what we're finding in those areas.
I think that's the basis, the current basis for how BMAPs work now, is sort of a generic attribution to a particular area or land use. And having followed our BMAP, Kusachi BMAP since the beginning, I would suggest it's perhaps why it's not as successful as it should be, because it goes on that basis. You have to control the source, the specific source of the contribution. And until you can do that, I just don't see significant progress. But thanks for the explanation.
Thank you for your comment.
Okay, Danielle, who is next?
Next up, we have Carrie Cates.
Okay, Carrie, please go ahead. Unmute, please. Carrie, we're not hearing you yet.
It looks like you may be on mute, Carrie. There you go.
Okay, Carrie, we're still not hearing you.
We're still not getting audio from Carrie.
Oh, and just a reminder that *6 mutes and unmutes your phone. Or maybe you need to unmute your computer. Okay, I guess we'll come back. Danielle, do we have anyone else?
No, that's all we have.
Okay, One last call for Carrie. Okay. Unfortunately, we're still not able to hear her. Hopefully she can provide her comments on the website. Well, with that.
So with that, we just want to thank everyone for your comments and questions. We'd also like to encourage you to provide your comments and any additional comments that you have in a written format to us. You can do that on the website. And I think Stephanie's going to try and pull up our website again for you. So that's https://www.sfwmd.gov/doing-business-with-us/rules. And that has also all of the draft rule text, additional information about this process, and the dates of our future workshops. We will also be posting any additional information that we have related to this rule at that same location. And so we look forward to hearing from some of you again, perhaps at our future workshops, and additional folks that will join us for our next workshop, which is Thursday, the 21st of May, and then we will have another workshop on the 3rd of June. And so thanks again for all of the comments and questions. We look forward to hearing from all of you and new folks in the future. We also look forward to providing an update. Spoiler alert, we will be providing a summary of how the process is going to the governing board at the June governing board meeting. And so those of you who are interested in hearing that summary can also tune in to the governing board meeting in June. And we will be providing a summary at that time. With that, thanks again for attending. And everyone stay well and stay safe.